So the mistake that autocratic rulers make in relation to the people is underestimating them, not giving them enough credit. That is the mistake that Mubarak made, and that is the mistake that Tantawi is now making. The people have learned, and they can recognize, they're actually quite savvy, they recognize the stalling tactics of this military council. They understand what is underway, which explains why we have had protest every day for the last month. Downside, however, is that counter-revolutionary forces, the army, the Americans, the wealthy elite, very well resourced, and they're very well organized. And they're capable of achieving a number of successes, as they have. Though I would venture to say that the use of paramilitary groups, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, is a sign that they're losing their cool and losing sight of what they were trying to achieve. So we ask ourselves, where were we before? I was just looking at where we are now, but where were we before? I summarize it and I say, before, we were poor. We were disempowered. We were ignorant. We were apathetic. We were despondent. And some 40 years of dictatorship, 30 years under Mubarak, has that effect on the people. Where are we now? We're still poor. We're still disempowered. We're still ignorant. But now we're engaged. We're no longer apathetic. And we're not despondent or despairing anymore. Now we're actually hopeful. And that is making a difference. Where are we headed? The trajectory. Where were we? Where are we? Where are we headed? Now that depends. How do we address those preceding dislocations? Poverty, disempowerment, ignorance. Now this final section in this conversation, in this talk, is based on chats that I had with members of the Revolutionary Council and a few other political parties during my time in Egypt. Now, poverty is something that everybody is concerned with. But being concerned with poverty doesn't mean much. The World Bank is concerned with poverty. The American government is concerned with poverty. The Saudi royals are concerned with poverty. It doesn't mean much. So when we look at it and we say we're concerned with poverty, our particular question, a more specific question, is what are we going to do about poverty? So the people are talking about land reform. The people are talking about land redistribution. The people are talking about taxation reform. Hey, and maybe even a little nationalization. These are very unreasonable demands, and the IMF will tell you so. Many of the Revolutionary Council are not speaking this same language. Many of the Revolutionary Council have been educated at private universities. They've been educated abroad. They are members of this wealthy elite. They hold key position in financial institutions, whether national or international. And they, as a result, are committed to Western economic rationality, i.e. neoliberalism. How we choose to tackle poverty depends. Do we follow the people and take this very unreasonable approach, or do we follow the elite and take a reasonable approach? Now, disempowerment also means different things to different people. To liberals and Democrats, and many members of the Revolutionary Council, disempowerment means the absence of the right to vote. Absence of the vote. And yes, this is an important level of disempowerment. But it is only one level of disempowerment. To others, disempowerment, just like democracy, means a tad more. If we can quote a particular revolutionary, Che Guevara, democracy cannot consist solely of elections that are nearly always fictitious and managed by rich landowners and professional politicians. So Egyptians, as I said, they're very politically savvy now, and they understand the direction they're headed in. So the people would like to see empowerment beyond the vote, because a vote and democracy can coexist alongside nepotism and corruption and inequality, as we see across Europe, North America, and in our area here. Now, tackling all of these, poverty, nepotism, corruption, etc., would be very unreasonable as well. And what of ignorance? Now, there are two levels of ignorance. We have formal ignorance, and we have substantive ignorance. Now, formal ignorance is tied to illiteracy. For all the positives and all the strengths of oral traditions, and we recognize that, we'll say that in this world, to succeed in this world, literacy, the ability to read and write, is critical. Illiteracy in Egypt is sitting at a whopping 45%. Nearly half the population cannot read or write. Substantive ignorance has more to do with creativity, or lack thereof. Now, Paulo Freire, Brazilian educationalist, fascinating individual, and if you ever get a chance, you might want to read one of his seminal texts, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He's dead, so I'm not making any money off that plug. He wrote that the problem with the oppressed is that the oppressed want to be free, but their understanding of freedom has been determined by the society in which they live. As a result, their understanding of freedom has been given to them by the oppressor. So in the end, what the oppressed do is often try to mimic the oppressor. So sitting there with members of the Revolutionary Council and speaking about illiteracy and asking them what they were going to do about illiteracy before the election, the answer was, we don't need to do anything about it because in fact we don't want the peasants to vote. Bit of a disconnect. So freedom is colored by experience, is colored by role models. And unfortunately, Egyptians have Mubarak and his clique, his cabal, as role models. Now, to be like the oppressor, to follow in the footsteps of the Americans, Europeans, to make demands for law, the rule of law, for democracy, that is reasonable. We don't want to upset our American patrons. We don't want to upset financial institutions. Our credit rating may diminish. So the dispute ends up being between reasonableness and unreasonableness. Do we behave reasonably? Do we behave unreasonably? Now, in answering this question, and I'll bring this talk to a close, in answering this question, I turn to George Bernard Shaw. He has this great line about reasonableness. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in adapting the world to himself. Ergo, all progress is made by the unreasonable man. All progress is made by the unreasonable man. Egyptians, for the last 30 to 40 years, have been behaving in a very reasonable fashion. This is where they were, in a place of reasonableness. A few months ago, they decided to turn reasonableness on its head and behave unreasonably. And as a result, they are conscious, they are aware, they are engaged, they are committed. But there are challenges. Why? Because reasonableness looms heavy on the horizon. Reasonableness has a certain appeal to it, a kind of hypnotic sheen. Who wants to be the unreasonable person in a relationship? Everybody wants to behave reasonably. And unfortunately, to behave reasonably means to behave like the oppressor. So reasonableness, unreasonableness. Which way are Egyptians headed? We do not know. So instead of answering that, I'm going to conclude with some words that, somewhat transcendentally, if you will, I wrote while I was in Tahrir Square. Like a volcano, a revolution changes the landscape. But this change may or may not be permanent, for tyranny, sadly, is easily defended. Before the dust settles, revolutionaries must move to establish a concrete plan that will provide for basic needs of their communities. Poverty, illiteracy, and vulnerability must be taken to task. All very unreasonable demands. Spontaneity may be necessary to spark a revolution, but justice is crucial to defeating oppression for good. In the words of another old revolutionary movement, a luta continua, the struggle continues. Thank you.